It started with a scream across the stars. A distress signal, fired off by the Allery in a final act of desperation. Their worlds were burning, cities shattered by Chlorith war engines, orbital defense rings torn apart like paper. No one answered their calls. The core worlds had long considered the Allery insignificant. The Outer Rim powers didn't want to provoke the Combine. And the Council? They debated resolutions while the ground turned to glass. So the Allery cast their signal wide. No encryption. No routing protocol. It went out raw, uncontrolled, bouncing through relay chains 1,000 years old. A last cry, cast into the void, praying someone, anyone, would hear it. But someone did. The signal, shredded and degraded, passed through a dormant Terran beacon buried deep in the void between arms of the galaxy. A device not registered on any star map. Forgotten by time. Yet it woke instantly. Old protocols activated. The message was parsed. Coordinates logged. Context flagged. Classification: unprovoked attack on non-combatant civilization. Response level: Terran Clause Omega. Action: forwarded. Somewhere far beyond the reach of galactic civilization, deeper than any charted lane, a world stirred. It had no name. The galactic lexicons listed it as uninhabitable. Class 13 Deathworld. Surface readings marked constant tectonic instability, megafauna aggression, extreme biosphere hostility, and over 70% lethal atmospheric variables. No species had returned from contact. But it was home. Buried beneath obsidian mountains and clouds dense with electrical storms, a signal lit up in the deep vaults of an ancient structure. Human, but changed. Post-human. Deathworlder. Built not for diplomacy, but endurance. Descendants of the old Terran legacy, forgotten by the galaxy, but never gone. The signal was received. Translated. Weighed. A decision followed. They didn't ask who the Allery were. They didn't ask what the Chlorith wanted. They only noted that civilians had called for help. And no one answered. So they would. In a hangar carved into the bedrock of a supervolcano, engines lit for the first time in 2 centuries. A vessel launched, not a sleek starship, but a blunt-edged machine built like a fortress. Its core ran on singularity compression. Its hull had no reflective surface, just matte black plates reinforced with adaptive polymers. Everything about it was built for one purpose: response. The crew was minimal. Automation handled logistics. Command was handled by Warborn, descendants of the old Earth military castes, forged through trial, not theory. Their doctrine was encoded into memory: never abandon the innocent. Never accept cruelty as law. Never leave a cry unanswered. They didn't use names. Only ranks, codes, and function. Emotion was a tool. Pity was a weakness. They'd survived the worst planet in the galaxy for 10,000 years. Now they were going to visit another. The ship breached into FDL without announcing itself. No diplomatic pings. No transponder beacons. No identification handshake. It wasn't coming to negotiate. Meanwhile, back in the civilized arm of the galaxy, the Allery continued dying. Their last city was surrounded. Their planetary shields collapsed days ago. The Chlorith weren't fighting a war, they were exterminating. No resources were at stake. No political value. They were doing it for control. To show others what happened when you defied their expansion. Children were slaughtered. Elders burned in the streets. The High Priestess of the Allery Council surrendered publicly, offering her life in exchange for her people's safety. They laughed and took her head as a trophy. Elsewhere, the Council continued to stall. Debates over trade impact. Fear of escalation. We condemn these actions, they said, even as the Allery biosphere turned to ash. 100 ships could have made a difference. They sent none. And then, the Terran ship arrived. No warning. No fleet. Just a dark object dropping out of warp over the Allery homeworld. The Chlorith detected it instantly. They'd fought every major species across 5 arms of the galaxy. Their fleet was hardened, veteran, confident. They prepared intercept formations. Weapons locked. Orders confirmed. But nothing made sense. The object didn't match any known configuration. No shield readings. No heat signature. No communication. It just descended. They fired first. The beam weapons hit dead center. And vanished. No impact. No damage. No response. Then the Terran ship moved. Not with speed, but certainty. It cut through the blockade like a god dragging a blade across the sky. One Chlorith cruiser vanished in a bloom of white-hot implosion. Another crumpled inward like wet paper. Their formations broke. No one had seen weapons fire. They simply died. On the surface, the Allery survivors looked up and saw the sky change color. Something had come. It didn't resemble anything they'd hoped for. It was colder. Meaner. Not salvation. Justice. Because the message that had reached the Deathworlders hadn't asked for help. It had asked if any decency remained in the stars. And Deathworlders weren't diplomats. They were the answer to a question the galaxy stopped asking centuries ago. What happens when humans stop talking? They start remembering. They were never supposed to survive. That was the consensus when Earth was last surveyed. Classified as a death world not because of radiation, gravity, or temperature, but because of evolution. Everything on the planet killed. Not just for survival, but competition. From the microbe to the apex predator, Earth was an ecosystem forged in conflict, perfected through extinction. The galaxy left it alone. The few expeditions sent in the early cycles never returned. One probe made it halfway through the atmosphere before its AI suffered a meltdown from the data feedback. The label humanity became a whisper. An outdated term used by historians and tacticians as a cautionary tale. Earth was quarantined not by law, but by fear. But the truth was worse. Humans didn't die out. They adapted. What the galaxy called collapse, they called the firebreak. A hard reset when interstellar ambitions were replaced with something more primal. Survive the homeworld, no matter the cost. Empires had failed, but the species endured. Technology slowed, then turned inward. When no help came, they stopped waiting. They turned their planet into a forge. Centuries passed. Generations hardened. Humanity fractured, then refined. Tribal divisions became castes. Warrior clans rose around old orbital ruins. Genetic drift accelerated. No longer just Homo sapiens, but something sharper, leaner, scarred by adaptation and trained by agony. They weren't unified, but they were aligned, bound by unspoken law, never abandon kin, never forget betrayal, and never trust the stars. Their history became oral, their knowledge encoded into memory, rituals, and embedded tech sealed in biological vaults. Memory was inheritance. Failure was education. Death was not the end, it was a contribution. The strongest took from the fallen, not as theft, but legacy. The planet shaped them. Storms that would scour other worlds became training grounds. Predators the size of dropships were hunted for initiation. Children learned war before they learned language. Cities existed, but buried. Camouflaged. Exposed infrastructure was weakness. Everything was armored, hidden, hardened. Nothing was sacred except survival and vengeance. Other species evolved through cooperation. Humans evolved through consequence. What the galaxy saw as madness, they saw as order. But they never forgot what had come before. Ancient vessels were disassembled, not destroyed. Fragments of old Earth language were preserved in battle chants, meditations, and war paint. Cultural memory carried the full spectrum of loss. They remembered being ignored. They remembered dying in silence. And most of all, they remembered the ones who turned away when Earth begged for help. So they created the responders. A caste bred and trained for one purpose, to answer calls no one else would. Each responder was marked with a sigil of echo, proof that they carried the burden of Earth's forgotten plea. It was burned into their skin, etched into their armor, embedded into their code. They were not soldiers. They were the answer. Not all humans became Deathworlders. Some clans fell to madness. Others pursued isolation. But the responders? They waited, watching ancient networks for the day the cycle repeated. They knew one day another species would send out a cry that no one would answer. And when that day came, humanity would not offer help. They would offer closure. The vessel that now moved through Chlorith-controlled space wasn't unique. It was one of many, scattered across the void in hibernation, each built from the bones of Earth's greatest dead and the genius of its last engineers. The crew inside had no names, only designations. Rook 9 was the tactician. Bred for logic under stress, trained with neurolocked war models that changed daily. Blade 2 was infantry. 7 feet tall, muscle-grown under triple gravity, silent even in battle. Cypher 0 was the memory core. A direct descendant of pre-collapsed Terran AIs, she carried emotional dampeners and archive access to every known human engagement. Their leader was simply Apex 1. He didn't speak often. When he did, it ended in blood. These weren't heroes. They weren't rescuers. They were symptom eradicators. They evaluated distress. Determined origin. Measured intent. If the source was deemed innocent, and the aggressor deemed without cause, the solution was absolute. No negotiation. No intervention. Just finality. The galaxy thought such moral absolutism was primitive. But to humans, morality was never a spectrum. It was a mirror. And the Chlorith had broken it. Apex 1 reviewed the signal 3 times. Not because he doubted it, but because he wanted to feel it. Alary distress was not just fear, it carried markers of innocence, desperation, and cultural refusal to retaliate. They hadn't provoked war. They hadn't fought back. They'd simply wanted to live. That was enough. The order was given. All systems transferred to aggression state. No fallback. No containment. No secondary objectives. Their mission wasn't to warn. It was to remove. The galactic codes meant nothing. No treaties applied. No council oversight held weight. This wasn't a political action. It was ancestral. Old Earth's final promise was simple: if the stars forget what justice looks like, we will remind them with flame. The Deathworlders were the reminder. They had waited centuries for the scream. Now they were moving. And nothing in the galaxy was ready. The last continent was falling. Alary resistance had collapsed into fragments. No military cohesion remained. What few defense platforms hadn't been vaporized were cannibalized to power evacuation shuttles, most of which never cleared atmosphere. The Chlorith didn't simply wage war, they erased. Orbital bombardment was constant. Precision strikes. Civilian zones targeted first. They weren't after conquest. They wanted submission through annihilation. City after city turned to white glass ruins. Coastal arcs flooded as tectonic disruptions shattered continents. Weather control grids failed. The skies went red. The Alary leadership had already dissolved. Their monarchs executed on live feeds. Regional governors captured and forced to order their own cities' destruction. Those who refused were mutilated and displayed as deterrents. What military remnants remained were overwhelmed by swarm tactics, relentless pressure, and psychotropic bombardment that crippled neural morale. No one came. Allies sent condolences. Neutrals offered platitudes. The Galactic Council held an emergency session, pointless, toothless, and 5 weeks too late. Trade blocs issued sanctions that the Chlorith ignored. Broadcasts pleaded for intervention. None arrived. The Chlorith laughed. For them, this was sport. They'd faced resistance from the Federation of Worlds, crushed rebellions in the Trispine colonies, and burned through half the Varelli belt. The Alary were nothing. No armies. No deterrents. No shields worth the name. Their technology was outdated, their command decentralized, and their population pacifist by doctrine. Easy prey. The final bastion, Highspire, was a refugee fortress built into the mountains. It held scholars, orphans, and medics. It wasn't a military target. That didn't matter. The Chlorith targeted it first. Dropships arrived in waves. Anti-personnel drones descended like locusts. There were no warnings. Only weapons. Inside, the Alary prepared for death. There were no illusions left. Their calls for help had vanished into nothing. The communications officers, once hopeful, now stared at dead terminals. The last encoded burst had drained their satellite network. Their world was isolated, bleeding, screaming, and utterly alone. They didn't beg. Alary culture prized dignity over desperation. But as the mountain walls shook, even that began to fracture. Some tried to escape into caverns. Others simply waited, arms wrapped around children, listening to the sound of their world ending above them. Then everything stopped. The noise halted mid-bombardment. Drones froze in place. Dropships stalled in mid-descent. An unnatural silence fell, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Something bigger. Something final. The air pressure shifted. Satellites flared offline. A single shadow eclipsed the upper atmosphere. It didn't match Chlorith profiles. No registration. No transmission. No known technology. Just a presence, blacker than space, colder than vacuum, moving without propulsion. It settled into low orbit with surgical calm. The Chlorith warships responded instantly. Targeting arrays locked on. Beam batteries armed. Drones redirected. They fired. And nothing happened. Every shot disappeared before impact. Every missile veered off course as if magnetically repelled. No explosion. No contact. No retaliation. Until the shadow moved. One Chlorith dreadnought, designated Threxel's hammer, ceased to exist. Not destroyed. Not detonated. Simply gone. The rest of the fleet hesitated. They'd never seen weapons like this. Their sensors showed no beam, no projectile, no energy discharge. Just loss. Ship by ship. In perfect silence. Then the voice arrived. It didn't broadcast on military bands or civilian networks. It echoed through every frequency at once, in every language, perfectly translated. You were warned by silence. You chose to speak with fire. Now you answer to flame. That was all. The Chlorith fleet opened fire with everything they had. The sky lit up. It made no difference. The Terran vessel responded without mercy. It didn't dodge. It didn't shield. It absorbed, adapted, erased. Return fire was invisible. No light, no sound, only aftermath. One cruiser folded in half. Another imploded in reverse. A command ship launched escape pods that scattered like insects before being incinerated mid-trajectory. Within minutes, the space above Highspire became a graveyard. On the ground, the drones that had swarmed the mountain began to malfunction. Systems crashed. Optics shattered. Targeting algorithms overloaded. Some exploded. Others fell limp. A column of kinetic force struck the valley. No blast, just sheer atmospheric pressure, compressing 100 Chlorith battalions into craters. Nothing biological remained. Just armor fragments and steaming rock. The Terrans didn't land. They deployed only a single pod, sleek, matte, coffin-shaped. It embedded in the ground near Highspire's front gates. The Allery watched, afraid to approach. Then the pod opened. Inside was a containment unit, holding food, water, medical nanites, atmospheric stabilizers. No soldiers emerged. No speeches were given. Only a small metallic plaque bolted to the side, engraved in Old Galactic. The scream reached us. You are not alone. Then the pod shut. No further response followed. The Terran ship remained in orbit another 36 minutes. Then it left. It didn't destroy the remaining Chlorith worlds. It didn't issue ultimatums. It didn't broadcast declarations. Its message had been delivered in full. Not as vengeance. Not as politics. But consequence. The Allery, once forgotten, had been heard. And the galaxy had just witnessed what happened when the wrong species answered an SOS. The Chlorith Empire responded with outrage. They did not understand what had happened above the Allery homeworld. Their forward fleet had been destroyed without explanation, without declaration of war. 73 vessels gone. No prisoners. No salvageable data. Commanders vaporized before issuing full distress signals. Their leadership assumed it was a new weapon, some experimental supertech deployed by one of the larger factions in secret. They demanded retribution. A retaliatory task force was launched, 300 warships, 5 Titan-class dreadnoughts, and orbital shock stations. Orders were clear: locate the unidentified vessel, engage at full capacity, retrieve any technology, and annihilate whatever was left of the Allery. They jumped into the system armed for genocide. What they found was silence. No Terran ship on sensors. No heat trails. No communication. Just ruins. Chlorith ruins. Their own wreckage, still drifting. Their own drones, reduced to slag. And the Allery, alive, organizing, rebuilding. They ordered immediate surface strikes. As weapons charged, every ship's systems froze. Not gradually. Instantly. Every targeting matrix, power relay, control interface, dead. Artificial gravity reversed on 6 cruisers. 2 dreadnoughts collapsed into themselves, crushed by their own mass containment failure. No warning. No countermeasure. Just annihilation without contest. The fleet panicked. Emergency FTL jumps scrambled. Escape vectors plotted. But nothing activated. Because they weren't alone anymore. The Terran ship didn't decloak. It didn't arrive. It had never left. It had waited in null space, undetectable, untrackable, impossible to reach, until now. It re-entered real space at point-blank range, directly inside the center of the Chlorith formation. Impossible. No mass signature registered. No drive activity recorded. It simply appeared. The Terrans didn't waste time. Their weapons weren't based on energy or kinetics. They used variables. Localized entropy spikes ruptured reactor cores. Chronoskips caused chain-of-command loops, disabling coordination. Causal inversion tech reversed decisions before they happened. The Chlorith ships broke apart, not from external attack, but from internal contradiction. Code eroded. Steel liquefied. Orders collapsed before they were issued. Entire bridge crews blinked out of sync with their own vessels. One dreadnought attempted to fire a final barrage. Its cannon completed ignition. Then the entire ship folded inside out, trapping its remains in a recursive time shell. Nothing escaped. The remaining Chlorith attempted to broadcast surrender. The Terrans didn't respond. Not from cruelty. Because they weren't listening. Surrender was irrelevant. Consequences were already underway. The Terrans moved through the debris field methodically, unchallenged. They weren't scavengers. They weren't there to claim victory. They were there to confirm execution. No escape pods were targeted. No survivors hunted. They had made their point. And now, they left again. In their wake, only emptiness remained. The Council finally reacted. Emergency meetings were called, species-wide security alerts triggered. Analysts reviewed the data in disbelief. This wasn't war as they understood it. It wasn't escalation. It wasn't deterrence. It was asymmetric eradication. A species had responded to a distress signal not with diplomacy or aid, but surgical annihilation. They traced the weapon signature. Ancient Terran code. Dead dialects buried in archive vaults. No active relay channels matched. One counselor asked the question everyone else was afraid to speak. Is humanity back? The room went silent. Because if it was true, the old doctrines would fail. No military power rivaled what Earth once possessed. Not because of numbers. Not because of ships. But because of philosophy. The Terrans didn't play galactic politics. They had no interest in territory. No economy. No influence networks. They operated on one principle: when innocents cry out and are ignored, someone must answer with force. And they had waited centuries for that moment. The Council debated contacting them. But no channels existed. No embassy could be established. No envoy could be sent. Because the Deathworlders were not a nation. They were a memory. And memories don't negotiate. Back in the ruins of the Chlorith fleet, a lone Terran artifact was found drifting in perfect synchronicity with the gravity well. A pod. Untouched by the battle. Inside, only one item. A data crystal. Encrypted with a dead Terran cipher. After 24 hours of Super AI decryption, the message was finally read. It contained no threats. No instructions. Only a single line. This was restraint. The galaxy understood. What had been unleashed was not total. Not full power. The Terrans hadn't escalated. They had responded with minimal force. What happened next would depend entirely on the galaxy's memory. The death toll from the Second Chlorith Fleet was 98%, all military. No colonies touched. No civilians harmed. Because the Terrans weren't indiscriminate. They were deliberate. Surgical. Judgmental. They had seen injustice. They had intervened. And now, every species in the galaxy had to ask the question. If the Deathworlders are watching, what else do they see? The signal data spread across the galaxy in hours. Fragments of the Chlorith fleet's final transmission leaked into shadow markets, intelligence nets, and black site observatories. No government admitted to reviewing it, yet every faction did. Each replayed the same visuals: ships vanishing without impact, dreadnoughts collapsing into themselves, entire fleets lost without explanation. There was no trace of conventional warfare. No visible discharge. No consistent pattern of attack. Only the undeniable outcome: obliteration. Speculation turned to fear. Some dismissed it as a myth, a false flag operation staged to discredit the Chlorith. Others knew better. Cross-reference logs from dead probes, archive-stored Terran linguistics, and obsolete military algorithms all pointed to one answer: the Deathworlders had returned. The old Earth warnings resurfaced. Not rumors. Records. Back-channel logs from centuries ago, before Earth went silent. Whispered statements from emissaries who encountered Terrans once and never again. Their reports shared the same conclusion: humans didn't fight for dominance. They responded to absence. If no one stopped evil, they would. And when they moved, they didn't stop halfway. Now they had moved again. The Chlorith Empire, bloodied and cornered, broadcast a formal surrender. Not to the Council. Not to the Allery. To the Void. A transmission directed at no one, because they didn't know who to contact. They simply sent a universal message: we yield, we submit, we cease. It was the first time in history a major power had surrendered to a force that never claimed responsibility, never issued demands, and never acknowledged receipt. Other empires took notice. The Dravari Alliance suspended all border conflicts indefinitely. The Ordak Syndicate purged its labor camps in public ceremonies, offering reparations to species they once enslaved. Dozens of minor powers began sweeping their histories clean, burning files, rewriting records, issuing apologies to victims of old wars they thought long buried. They weren't repenting out of morality. They were cleaning their footprints, hoping to avoid attention. The Galactic Council, fractured and desperate, called a closed-door session. They reviewed all known Terran records, every half-legible log, every survivor account. The oldest entry came from a mining vessel 3,000 years ago that made orbit over Earth and picked up a human signal. They had interpreted the signal as hostile. Their crew fired warning shots. They were never heard from again. Only their final sensor ping remained, followed by 3 words in Terran dialect: do not provoke. That warning, ignored then, now returned as prophecy. A motion passed unanimously: all member species would cease expansion operations into uncharted systems. No SOS frequency would be used without review. And no military action would be taken against unaligned species without confirmation of hostile intent. It was the first time the Council had enforced a real constraint. Because now, the cost of aggression was unpredictable. Some species believed the Deathworlders were machines, rogue AIs from Terran origin, cold and indiscriminate. Others insisted they were still human, enhanced, evolved, buried under centuries of survival, emerging only when they deemed it necessary. No one could confirm either theory. Because no one could find them. Scans of Earth's system showed no life. No energy signature. No detectable orbital traffic. But the moment a stealth probe reached its upper atmosphere, it vanished. Not shot down. Not disrupted. Just erased. As if the system itself refused to be observed. The conclusion was unavoidable. Earth wasn't just a death world. It was a trap. Some factions prepared for war anyway. They drafted contingency protocols, constructed void fortresses, deployed anti-Terran fail-safes based on outdated combat assumptions. But their leaders knew these defenses were for morale, not survival. Because there was no countermeasure against what had been shown. No defense against retribution wrapped in silence. The Deathworlders hadn't claimed power. They had demonstrated it. Without ceremony. Without recognition. Without interest in conquest. Their existence alone shifted the balance of the galaxy. For the first time in generations, systems known for corruption initiated reforms. Slave markets were shuttered. Genetic purity laws were repealed. Predatory trade agreements dissolved overnight. Not from empathy. From fear. Worlds once proud of their brutality now silenced their histories. Because now they knew. Every time someone called for help, the signal might reach a ghost planet. And if those ghosts answered, fire would follow. Some species issued open messages to the Terrans. Declarations of respect. Gratitude. Offers of alliance. They received no reply. Others issued threats. Those threats stopped when the sender's relay stations melted without warning. No casualties. Just removal of voice. The message was consistent. Speak with care. The Allery, now safe, recovered faster than expected. With their survival came influence. Refugees from other threatened systems fled to them. The galaxy saw them not as victims, but as chosen. Protected by a force that had no flag, no claim, and no tolerance for injustice. The Allery never exploited their status. They simply rebuilt. But every new structure bore a symbol, a black star above a silent planet. A warning. A promise. A reminder that the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever known was still watching. And they only moved when no one else would. The Chlorith Combine rarely took prisoners, but this time, they were the ones in chains. One of their highest-ranking fleet masters, Drolvek, had been recovered alive, though barely. His escape pod was the only one not destroyed in the Second Fleet's collapse. Found adrift near the ruins of their own dreadnought, he had expected death. Instead, he was intercepted, extracted, and contained. He wasn't interrogated by the Allery. They lacked the tools and the resolve. He wasn't handed over to the Council. They lacked the authority. He was given to the ones who had ended his empire. The chamber was bare. No restraints, no weapons, no guards. Just one figure waiting. Human in shape, but not entirely. Taller. Denser. Clad in adaptive armor etched with ancient Terran glyphs. No name given. No identification. Only a designation, Apex 1. Drolvek demanded terms. He received silence. He offered intelligence, bargaining chips, strategic codes. No response. He finally asked what he wanted to know. What did the Deathworlders want? Apex 1 answered with no expression. Debt. Drolvek laughed. He called it primitive. Called their intervention disproportionate. Called their attack a violation of every interstellar accord. Told them they had started a war without cause. Apex 1 said nothing. He simply activated a sequence, projecting raw sensor data into the chamber. Allery cities before the strike. Civilian clusters marked. Children fleeing. Medical stations turned to rubble. Non-combatants executed in public arenas. The projection ended with the image of a single transmission. The Allery SOS. Unanswered. Ignored. Forgotten. Until Earth heard it. Apex 1 spoke again. You did not start a war. You revealed one. Drolvek tried to reframe the narrative. He claimed the Allery were weak, unclaimed space, legitimate for conquest. He invoked ancient Chlorith law. Apex 1 replied without emotion. Power does not create legitimacy. It defines consequence. Drolvek asked why they intervened now, after so long. Because no one else did. He asked why Earth stayed silent for millennia. We waited. For what? For proof that the galaxy learned to protect its own. Apex 1 stepped forward. You failed. Drolvek changed tactics. He threatened retaliation, claiming allies across the stars would rise to avenge the Combine. Apex 1 looked at him without blinking. There will be no rise. There is only memory. Yours ends here. Still, no execution came. Drolvek wasn't there to be punished. He was there to understand. The Deathworlders didn't take vengeance personally. They acted on principle. When a distress signal went unanswered, they answered it. Not for favor. Not for politics. For balance. To remind the stars that silence wasn't protection, it was complicity. Drolvek, stripped of his empire, demanded the right to live. Apex 1 said nothing. Instead, a sidewall opened, revealing dozens of data slates, names, images, audio fragments. Not of warriors. Of innocents. The dead. The forgotten. Apex, 1 stepped aside and gestured. Read. Drolvek refused. He was left alone with the records. Hours passed. The chamber lights never dimmed. No food, no distraction. Just the weight of evidence. The cries of civilians. The last messages sent by children. The faces of those exterminated while Drolvek's fleet laughed. He tried not to look. Eventually, he did. There was no lecture. No moral plea. Only history. Unfiltered. Unforgiving. By the time Apex 1 returned, Drolvek was silent. He asked if death would follow. Apex 1 replied calmly. No. Death is the easy answer. Your kind has forgotten what memory feels like. So we will leave you alive. Drolvek frowned. For what purpose? Apex 1 turned to go. So you carry the shame your empire buried. No one ever saw Drolvek again. He vanished from council records. Some say he was returned to his homeworld in silence. Others believe he was dropped into uninhabited space, forced to witness every suffering he helped create. Wherever he went, he carried knowledge no Chlorith ever had. The Deathworlders didn't act for revenge. They acted to correct failure. Because the stars had rules once. And humanity never forgot them. The council issued a quiet decree. All distress signals now required immediate triage. Any failure to respond would be considered negligence. Independent networks sprang up to monitor signals, to ensure no more cries for help were lost in bureaucracy. It wasn't policy. It was fear. Apex 1 and his crew returned to the void. No base. No world. No empire. Their ship was seen once more, hovering over a mining colony where a rebellion had begun massacring workers. Within minutes of the vessel's arrival, the executions stopped. The rebels surrendered without engagement. The ship never landed. It just left. No demands. No flag. Just presence. The message was spreading across the galaxy faster than any fleet. If you harm the helpless, if you silence the desperate, if you become the thing you once feared, they will come. And you will not get a second chance. Across the galaxy, a new belief emerged, unplanned, uncoordinated, and unspoken. It didn't begin in temples or through sermons. It began in whispers. In backroom conversations and encrypted message boards. On fractured worlds once abandoned by the powerful, rumors bloomed. Survivors of atrocities began describing the same impossible phenomenon, a black ship, human but not, appearing at the moment before extinction, dismantling threats without warning or diplomacy, then vanishing. No name was ever given. No proof ever recorded. But the survivors believed. The Deathworlders had become more than a force. They were becoming myth. But not all myths were comforting. Some species began to reframe them. The Varen Collective declared the Deathworlders divine arbiters, agents of galactic balance. They built silent shrines on asteroid belts, carved their beliefs into dead rock. They didn't ask for blessings. They offered remembrance. Victims' names etched in alloy. Atonement displayed in orbital rings. Others attempted mimicry. The Syrinx Dominion, desperate to redirect attention away from their centuries of oppression, fabricated false signals, faked distress transmissions and staged rescues to appear under Deathworlder protection. They constructed warships mimicking Terran hull shapes, black-plated and angular, hoping the illusion would be enough to shield them. It wasn't. The first time one of their fleets entered contested space under false pretense, it disappeared. Not attacked. Not confronted. Just gone. All beacons lost. No debris left. Within hours, every Syrinx communication relay shorted out, rendering their vast propaganda network blind. The message was clear: you do not impersonate the judgment you've never earned. Meanwhile, true terror spread in darker corners of the galaxy. Syndicates that thrived in shadows, piracy rings, slave networks, death game arenas, began disappearing. Entire moon hubs went silent. Merchant guilds that traded in biological contraband found their transport lanes erased. Black markets, once thought untouchable, were shut down in absolute silence. No witnesses. No survivors. Just gaps. Where corruption once flourished, now there was only absence. The Council's intelligence agencies couldn't trace the operations. No transmissions. No fleet movement. No resource trails. Just a growing ledger of factions that no longer existed. Some speculated it wasn't just one ship anymore. They believed more were waking. The idea took hold fast. If Earth had built one answer to injustice, why not more? Perhaps there were dozens. Hundreds. Entire branches of Terran descendants, waiting in voids between the stars, watching, calculating, preparing. If so, the implications were immense. Because no one knew the limits of their restraint. Yet the Deathworlders never escalated. Their targets remained surgical. Precision applied only where the cries of the innocent had been ignored. This discipline unsettled the great powers more than raw destruction. Predictable violence was manageable. This was worse. It was selective, calculated, deeply aware, and it operated on a code no empire controlled. Those who once viewed the Terrans as primitive now understood the opposite was true. They weren't savages. They were principled in a way the galaxy had forgotten. A silence followed wherever they passed. The kind that made leaders rethink orders before giving them. That made war councils second-guess border campaigns. That made crime lords cancel raids before they began. Not because the Deathworlders might come, but because they might already be there. The effect wasn't limited to criminals. Bureaucracies shifted. Resource allocation to civilian protection increased. Trade routes were re-evaluated based on security and fairness. Border patrols began rescuing stranded migrants instead of ignoring them. Sectors once dismissed as too remote received aid packages and structural support. For the first time in galactic history, governments acted preemptively to prevent suffering, not for gain, not for image, but because they didn't want to be judged. And judgment, everyone now understood, wasn't announced. It arrived. Uninvited. Unstoppable. One high-level council member posed the question that echoed through intelligence circles. What would happen if the Deathworlders ever decided the entire galactic order was broken? What if one signal wasn't enough? What if the whole system was found guilty? No one had an answer. So they worked harder to avoid it. They reviewed forgotten war crimes. Paid out reparations in the trillions. Held tribunals for ancient atrocities. Leaders previously untouchable were stripped of power, tried, and sentenced. Not because of guilt, but optics. Survival through justice. Still, no contact came. Not from Earth. Not from any Deathworld or enclave. Nothing. Just results. Some began to fear the silence more than the strikes. It meant they were still watching. That more names were being logged, more decisions weighed. Every inaction, every denial, every delayed response now carried risk. The galaxy had changed. Not through invasion. Not through conquest. Through fear of failing a standard no one remembered setting, but that everyone now recognized. One that wasn't written in law, but one that had always been there. Buried beneath bureaucracy. Lost in centuries of decay. A standard that only a forgotten species, burned, scarred, and silent, still remembered. And enforced with perfect clarity. The requests began as messages of gratitude. Short, encrypted transmissions sent across secure bands. Civilians from fringe colonies. Isolated settlements. Refugee fleets still drifting from old wars. They didn't ask for rescue. They asked for acknowledgement. For the Deathworlders to know they existed. To know they had survived. Then came the petitions. Structured. Formal. Some even embossed with the sigils of planetary governments. These weren't cries for help, they were invitations. Offers of alliance. Proposals for guidance. Entire nations requesting not military aid, but moral direction. They wanted to be taught. The Council watched with quiet dread as old alliances began to shift. Independent systems withdrew from established pacts, citing irreconcilable values. Trade unions restructured their charters to include humanitarian thresholds. Merchant fleets refused contracts that might exploit lesser-developed species. Not because of ethics. Because somewhere, in the dark, a Terran vessel might be listening. And now, everyone wanted to know what those vessels deemed acceptable. The Deathworlders had never spoken of ideology. They had made no declarations. Yet they had become the new moral axis, the invisible authority that no one voted for but everyone feared disappointing. The first open appeal came from a frontier world, Relon 3, ravaged by a decades-long conflict between native separatists and foreign miners. Both sides had committed atrocities. Neither side trusted the other. The planetary governor sent a single haunting message. We no longer know who is right. If you are watching, show us how to stop before we become what you destroy. There was no reply. Not immediately. But 3 days later, both sides received identical data packets. Coordinates. Instructions. Medical schematics. Drone plans capable of autonomous relief deployment. No commentary. No judgment. Just tools, precise, sufficient, balanced. And both sides complied. The war ended within a week. It was the first time in galactic history a planetary conflict resolved through anonymous intervention alone. Others followed. A penal colony seeking to dismantle its inhumane labor program. A corporate state requesting oversight of its AI workforce protocols. A nomadic flotilla asking how to secure food without raiding trade lanes. Each received tailored responses. No names. No explanations. Only solutions. The Deathworlders were no longer just a deterrent. They had become the arbiters of balance. The Council's authority eroded in real time. Their declarations were now cross-checked against Terran compliance. Security ratings on planetary networks were rewritten to include a variable, potential for Deathworlder intervention. Economists revised models to account for a new pressure, ethical volatility. Leaders tried to reassert dominance. They accused those seeking Terran answers of cowardice, of destabilizing the existing order. But the populations didn't care. Because for the first time, justice was not delayed. It was not debated. It was executed with perfect efficiency and no tolerance for hypocrisy. The galaxy was learning. The Deathworlders would not lead empires. They would not rule. They would not interfere for politics or profit. They would only act when others failed to. This restraint, more than anything, earned them reverence. Because they could have demanded anything, and didn't. They could have taken control, and refused. What terrified the powers was not what the Deathworlders did. It was what they didn't do. They left no bureaucracy behind. No replacement governments. No tribute taken. Only correction. Measured. Total. Unapologetic. Some species, unaccustomed to such clarity, tried to formalize the relationship. Delegates were dispatched to find them. Treaties were drafted. Diplomatic pacts offered. None were acknowledged. Not one Deathworlder responded to a diplomatic request. Not one allowed contact. Not one revealed their location. Yet every time a cry went out into the dark from those with no allies and no leverage, help still came. Not always with violence. Sometimes just knowledge. Sometimes just a warning. Sometimes only silence, and that was answer enough. Entire cultures shifted under this new weight. Art evolved. Literature, once centered on conquest or despair, turned toward consequence. Children grew up hearing tales of Terrans not as monsters, but as guardians who did not forgive lies. Their silence had become sacred. And still, no one knew who they were now. Were they descendants of old Earth, evolved beyond recognition? Were they artificial beings preserving extinct ideals? Were they even human? Or had humanity become something else entirely? Memory wearing flesh, vengeance made logical? The answer didn't matter. Because their effect was real. Entire galactic zones once considered lost to chaos were now stabilizing, not through enforcement, but fear of neglect. No one wanted to be the next species on the wrong side of their code. The term Deathworlder shifted in tone. Once spoken in warning, it was now said in hope. Not everyone understood them. But more and more wanted to try. Not to exploit their power, but to earn their silence. Because in the new age rising across the stars, quiet from the void meant only one thing. You were doing something right. Power fears what it cannot control. The galaxy had adapted to fear. But fear breeds ambition, and ambition finds cracks even in silence. Somewhere deep in the unregistered sectors, a coalition of old-world powers formed in the dark. Not governments. Not pirates. Something older. Quiet syndicates. Disavowed think tanks. Decommissioned war architects. They called themselves the Continuum, born from one goal: to isolate and control the Deathworlders. They believed fear was a weapon. That what the Terrans had created was a myth, and myths could be reverse-engineered. To them the answer was simple: provoke a response, capture it, study it, replicate it. Their plan was deliberate. They selected a colony no one would miss. Populated by refugees, unclaimed by any state. Remote enough to disappear, loud enough to draw attention. The Continuum staged a false atrocity, horrors designed for emotional resonance. Children left to suffer, entire villages staged in agony, their cries recorded and broadcast on all bands. A synthetic SOS, made perfect through algorithms that mirrored real desperation. Then they waited. The Deathworlders came. But not in the way the Continuum had hoped. No ships entered orbit. No visible force deployed. The sky remained untouched. Instead, the Continuum's own satellites blinked out. Their tracking systems went blind. Their communications shut down. Every encrypted server went dead. AI cores began rewriting their own directives. Internal sensors recorded movement within facilities marked as secure. No alarms triggered. Just silence. And then collapse. The Continuum's leadership vanished in under 9 minutes. Each cell worldwide suffered critical failure. Biometric logs erased. Memory cores slagged. Their locations weren't attacked. They were bypassed. Every layer of protection ignored, every safeguard irrelevant. Not a single operative was killed, because death was too light a sentence. They were erased from every database that acknowledged they existed. In 1 hour, the Continuum ceased to exist. No records. No legacy. Only blank space where information used to be. The galaxy noticed. This was not the Terrans correcting injustice. This was them punishing manipulation. Because the Deathworlders weren't a force to be studied. They weren't a pattern to predict. They were judgment. They moved by principle, not logic. The Continuum had tried to simulate the innocent to bait them. It worked. And that was the last thing they ever did. Now the fear shifted again. Before, governments feared being punished for cruelty. Now, they feared being punished for pretense. Even good intentions came under scrutiny. Aid organizations tripled their transparency. Relief fleets logged every action in triplicate. Humanitarian efforts were no longer just gestures. They had to be real. Honest. Verified. Because falsehood carried consequences far greater than failure. The council convened in emergency once more. This time, not to debate, but to confess. They released files hidden for centuries. Archived cover-ups. Civilian death counts long buried. Wars declared for profit. Genocides classified as containment events. All of it. They knew it wouldn't earn forgiveness. But they hoped it might by time. What terrified them wasn't that the Deathworlders acted without warning. It was that they acted without bias. Old enemies were punished. But so were former allies. One trade empire, once friendly to Earth before the long silence, had been caught stockpiling population control weapons. Never used. Only prepared. It was enough. Their factories were dismantled in the dark. No casualties. Just neutralization. One governing system learned their internal judiciary had been quietly selling exile sentences to mining guilds as labor contracts. The next day, every judge vanished. Only 3 words left behind. We were listening. The galaxy realized something profound. The Deathworlders didn't want control. They didn't want tribute, leadership, territory. They wanted integrity. But not the performative kind. Not declarations and treaties. Only action. Only truth. Only defense of those who could not defend themselves. And if any power thought itself clever enough to game that standard, to forge virtue for strategic advantage, they would meet the fate of the Continuum. Even mentioning their name became dangerous. It wasn't censorship. It was a collective trauma response. To speak of the Continuum was to acknowledge an arrogance that the galaxy now understood could never be allowed again. The message had crystallized. You could be powerful. You could be flawed. You could make mistakes. But you could not pretend. Not anymore. That age was over. The galaxy, for the first time, was being made honest. Not by politics. Not by war. But by fear of a standard none of them had written, yet all of them now followed. Because above every empire, every flag, every broadcasted declaration of unity, there now floated one silent shadow, seen or unseen, remembered or feared. The Deathworlders are watching. And they know the difference between suffering and spectacle. Galactic memory is short, but legacy, when carved deep enough, becomes irreversible. In the wake of the Deathworlders' return, that legacy could no longer be denied. What had begun as myth, as vengeance, had become a moral constant. Not enforced by decree, not upheld by armies, but by the terror of being seen by something incorruptible. Civilizations that once ruled by fear now ruled by example. Transparency wasn't optional anymore, it was survival. The strongest fleets were those built for evacuation, not destruction. The most valuable currency became credibility, not firepower. Propaganda ministries crumbled under their own lies, replaced by citizen-led truth boards. Justice stopped being a system. It became a mirror held to every world's face, asking one question: would the Deathworlders intervene here? That question, unspoken yet universal, reshaped every decision. New species arriving on the galactic stage no longer raced to gain influence or territory. Instead, they raced to prove moral alignment. Initiation treaties were rewritten to include humanitarian thresholds. Settlements were built with oversight protocols embedded into the architecture. The very idea of conquest was now suicidal, not because others would fight back, but because the Deathworlders might notice. Their presence remained sparse. But when they acted, they did so with finality. A warbroker nation that disguised private military operations as peacekeeping missions was erased overnight. No weapons were used. Just system-wide exposure, hidden files dumped into the public net, voice logs of premeditated betrayals, financial links to black market organ trading. The population revolted before the Deathworlders ever stepped in. When the people demanded execution of their own leaders, it wasn't fear. It was shame. And shame had become a greater weapon than annihilation. The galaxy had long believed in escalation. Now it believed in restraint. The irony wasn't lost on the elders of surviving civilizations. The most feared species in existence didn't conquer. They didn't demand servitude. They didn't expand. Instead, they held still and made the stars rotate around their silence. An old broadcast recovered from a forgotten satellite described the Terrans before their disappearance. A human voice, calm but unyielding, had spoken a line once dismissed as poetic metaphor. The purpose of strength is not dominance. It's to ensure no one suffers alone. Now, it wasn't metaphor. It was law. Worlds once ruled by despots built monuments, not to their own dead, but to the dead of others, those they had harmed. Some believed it was for show. Others believed it was a desperate plea for forgiveness from a force that didn't answer. But the Deathworlders never responded to spectacle. Only sincerity. And sincerity had no language. It had only action. One frontier system quietly enacted reforms after centuries of exploiting local fauna for entertainment. They received no contact, no recognition. Yet when a plague struck their capital, a relief package arrived, untraceable, perfectly calibrated, and encoded in Terran medical dialect. No message. Just results. That was all the confirmation they needed. The Deathworlders were watching. But they didn't act to reward or punish. They acted to balance. No praise came for doing the right thing. No congratulations. The reward was simply not being erased. And for the first time, that was enough. The Council restructured and reformed, issued a final declaration. Any signal ignored without review would be grounds for immediate investigation. Any unprovoked aggression would be considered a potential trigger for external intervention. Every major power signed it, not out of solidarity, but out of shared survival instinct. No one wanted to be the reason the Deathworlders returned again in force. Not because of destruction, but because of the reminder that some things, once broken, would never be forgiven. As time passed, humanity itself became less of a species and more of a concept. A living boundary line. An invisible consequence. Their name invoked not in threat, but in awe. They were no longer just Deathworlders. They were the weight of every decision made when no one else was watching. And the galaxy changed to meet that weight. You couldn't bribe them. You couldn't predict them. You couldn't survive them if you tried to fake virtue. So instead, The galaxy did the only thing it could. It became better. Not out of hope. Out of fear. But eventually, fear gave way to structure. And structure gave way to habit. New generations were raised under this influence, never knowing a galaxy without that silent standard. They didn't grow up fearing humanity. They grew up trying to be worthy of their silence. Centuries passed. New crises emerged. But the response never changed. Somewhere in the void, Terran ships still waited. No empire found them. No diplomat reached them. But the signals kept being answered. Quietly. Ruthlessly. Justly. The galaxy, once fractured and cruel, had reshaped itself in the image of a species that never asked for worship, never accepted leadership, and never forgave deceit. Their revenge had ended. Their war was over. But their memory had become a force larger than fleets, larger than stars. And that memory whispered one eternal truth into the bones of every civilization, every captain, every leader faced with a choice. If you do nothing, they will.